As they say, if there is land, then humanity will definitely divide it. Look at this political map of Antarctica. In 1961, the Antarctic Treaty was signed, in which each other was strictly prohibited from establishing military bases on the continent, as well as from extracting minerals. 50 countries, including the United States, Russia, and China, signed and ratified the treaty. However, in 2048, the treaty expires, and then the countries will probably return to the question of how to divide Antarctica. The issue could seriously escalate if global warming actually proceeds as scientists predict. By 2048, the Antarctic climate will be approximately the same as it is now in Norway. So far, 7 nations have laid claim to the continent. Each nation has its own research stations in Antarctica, but they are located in chaotic places throughout the continent, so it will not be possible to form any national clusters. Scientists from 30 countries are now stationed at more than 70 research stations near the South Pole. The average population of Antarctica varies from 4,000 people in summer to 1,000 people in winter. And if we return to this map, which can be called the claim map, it is easy to see that the boundaries of national sectors are meridians converging at the pole. But 4 countries at once put forward their claims to the popular Antarctic Peninsula: Argentina, Chile, Brazil, and Great Britain. This popularity can easily be explained by the fact that the peninsula is the warmest part of Antarctica, and the state territories of Chile and Argentina are very close, at the other end of the Drake Passage. However, all these territorial fantasies of many countries in the prospects of 2048 are cooling the positions of the 2 states. The positions of the Russian Federation, the successor state of the country that discovered the continent, and the United States, which has the largest staff of researchers on the polar continent, are currently unanimous: Antarctica cannot be crossed by state borders, it must become a continent of friendship and cooperation between representatives of different nations. In light of this, it is difficult to imagine that Antarctica once almost became part of the Russian Empire. But before we continue, we have an important announcement for you. Well, now let's continue. During the great geographical discoveries, vast regions became the property of states whose subjects discovered them. The discoverers gave them their names and organized colonies of settlers. The existence of Antarctica was proven by Russian sailors during a research expedition led by Thaddeus Bellingshausen and Mikhail Lazarev. 200 years ago, in January 1820, they discovered the 6th continent, the harshest and most unsuitable for human life. But why didn't the new territory become part of the Russian Empire, and how did it open? On July 16, 1819, the sloops Vostok and Mirny, specially equipped for a long voyage, left the Kronstadt roadstead and set off on their famous journey. 190 people took part in it. Captain 2nd rank Thaddeus Bellingshausen was appointed head of the Antarctic expedition, and Officer Mikhail Lazarev was appointed his assistant. The expedition was financed by the state, but pursued more scientific goals than political ones. Although the matter could not have been done without politics, it is unlikely that the Russian emperor would have refused the opportunity to rub the nose of the British and others. From the very first days, scientific observations were made, which Bellingshausen and the team recorded in the logbook. The expedition consisted of volunteers with excellent health, experience, and literacy. They were loaded with supplies for 2 years, but during the voyage they constantly had to replenish supplies at ports along the route. Among the shortcomings of training, we can highlight different characteristics of the vessels. Vostok was fast and had good maneuverability, but was weaker than Mirny. The team had a hard time dealing with storms and ice. Mirny had a stronger hull and felt good in ice, since it was rebuilt from an icebreaker transport, but was quite slow-moving. Russian sailors set off on a long and dangerous journey to uncharted shores. They did not know what awaited them there, what trials and hardships fate would give them. The sailors made their way through ice, cold, freezing rain and storms. There was no connection with the house, and the final goal could turn out to be a myth. But, despite this, During the entire journey the expedition lost only 3 people. The expedition sailed for 751 days and covered more than 92,000 kilometers. The ship several times left the southern waters to the north, where conditions were more favorable, but returned and looked for a way to the mainland. Waiting for more favorable conditions, the sloops explored the islands of Polynesia in the tropical Pacific Ocean and even discovered 15 new islands that bear Russian names. The date of discovery of Antarctica is considered to be January 28, 1820. On this day, the Mirny and Vostok approached the future Queen Maud Land. The ships crossed the Antarctic Circle several times, moving along the mainland. In early February we again approached Antarctica, to a place called the Princess Astrid Coast, but the weather was very bad and we were unable to clearly see anything. In the spring it was no longer possible to sail off the coast of the mainland, and ships took different routes to the port of Jackson, Sydney. They took a second trip to the shores of Antarctica in November and discovered the islands of Peter I, Shishkov, Mordvinov, and Alexander Island. On January 30, 1821, it turned out that the Vostok had leaked, and the expedition had to be ended. On July 24 they returned to Kronstadt. Alexander I was pleased with the expedition and rewarded all participants, but made the main mistake: he did not claim the right to the discovery. Apparently, the emperor believed that Russia had enough land, and besides, it was unclear what to do with this Alaska, and then there was a distant continent where there was only ice. How to control and protect such a distant territory? What use could it possibly have? For a long time, no one was interested in the sixth continent. Separate expeditions were sent there, but no one really claimed their rights. And no one disputed the discovery of Russian sailors. Until it became clear that Antarctica is a treasure for all humanity. Fearing that it would go to the USSR, the countries decided to quickly sign a special convention in 1959. It came into force in 1961, and, according to it, the mainland does not belong to any of the states. The placement of military facilities and the entry of warships are prohibited. Since the 80s, Antarctica has also been declared a nuclear-free zone. 50 states are parties to the treaty, and dozens are observers. Today there are about 5 dozen scientific stations operating in Antarctica. Russia has 7 permanent stations and 1 field base. This does not end the list of amazing facts about Antarctica. Here's something else. Life under miles of ice. In the subglacial lakes of Antarctica, there may be life that evolved over millions of years completely separately from the rest of the Earth. In total, more than 140 subglacial lakes have been discovered in Antarctica. But the most famous of them is Lake Vostok, located near the Soviet and later Russian Antarctic station Vostok, which gave the lake its name. There is a 4-kilometer thick layer of ice above the lake, but the lake itself, thanks to the underground geothermal springs located beneath it, does not freeze. The water temperature in the depths of the lake is 10 degrees Celsius. It is this thickness of ice, according to scientists, that could serve as a natural insulator that preserved unique living organisms, which all these millions of years developed and evolved completely separately. There are 2 points of view on the topic of who exactly lives under the ice between the Vostok station and the lake of the same name. One of them is American, the other is Russian. The first is based on the results of shallower drilling that the United States carried out in the area in the 90s. Then it was possible to get only ice above the lake, that which was formed from its waters, gradually rising up and freezing. Based on the results of the analysis of its samples, Scott Rogers' group found gene sequences of 1,623 species there using the metagenomic method. Of these, 6% belong to rather complex creatures, eukaryotes, creatures with a distinct nucleus surrounded by a wall. Something so complex was least expected to be seen at a depth of several kilometers. Moreover, one of the types of bacteria, presumably found in this way, lives only in the intestines of fish. It simply does not occur separately from them. Gene sequences typical of rotifers and mollusks were also found. From this, the American group concluded that among the inhabitants of Lake Vostok there may be extremely complex creatures, even fish and crustaceans. According to one hypothesis, the lake existed in the form of an open reservoir for tens of millions of years and only the last 14 to 15 million were hidden by ice. This means, the researchers believe, that local fish and crustaceans had a lot of time to gradually adapt to underwater conditions. Moreover, if they are there, they can make the extreme conditions of the east not so extreme. Oxygen-breathing organisms could consume the excess oxygen entering the lake along with the ice. Then, in the depths of the lake, there may not be an excess of this gas, a strong oxidizing agent, near which life can be difficult. Russian scientists reacted extremely coldly to this discovery. They quite rightly pointed out that the drilling was carried out using technical fluids contaminated with ordinary soil and other bacteria. It is almost impossible to distinguish external pollution from local residents without the use of clean drilling. Domestic researchers believe that in such conditions it is possible to talk about real Eastern life only if genetic sequences are found that are completely unlike anything else. And specialists from the St. Petersburg Institute of Nuclear Physics of the Russian Academy of Sciences managed to find bacterial DNA there that did not match any of the known species. It is so alien to them that it was not even possible to place it in any group of bacteria. 14% of its genes are not found in any other known species. As Sergei Bulat said then, this DNA is so unlike anything else that if it were found on Mars, they would undoubtedly say that this is life from Mars. Although this is terrestrial DNA. However, these are just bacteria, simple, single-celled, without bells and whistles and unnecessary complexity. Genes for something unexpected and even more complex, but at the same time different from terrestrial species, have not yet been found in ice samples. So, in the opinion of our scientists, eukaryotes and even multicellular ones like fish are cancelled there for now. This may not be a bad thing. Fish that live without light and the supply of nutrients from above must be so alien to everything that we know that, in fact, they would not be much different from any little green man from the stories of creative ufologists. Alps in Antarctica. In Antarctica there is a mountain range comparable in size to the Alps. These mountains are called the Gamburtsev Mountains after the name of the Soviet geophysicist and academician whose expedition in 1958 discovered their existence. The length of the mountain range is 1,300 kilometers, width, from 200 to 500 kilometers. The highest point is 3,390 m. Well, now the most interesting thing, this whole thing rests under a huge layer of ice. On average, the thickness of the ice cover over the mountains is 600 meters, but there are areas where the ice thickness is more than 4 kilometers. There are no time zones in Antarctica. Antarctica is the only continent on the planet that is not divided into time zones and time zones. There is no specific time of its own in Antarctica either. All scientists and expedition members living there rely either on the time of their home country or on the time of the employees who deliver supplies to them. Antarctica contains 70% of all fresh water on the planet. Surprisingly, Antarctica is the driest place on Earth. If you look at it, there is nothing strange here. Freshwater reserves are, of course, ice. Well, the situation with precipitation here is really bad, only 18 millimeters per year. Compare, even in the Sahara Desert, 76 mm of precipitation falls per year. In Antarctica there is a sea with the clearest water in the world. This is the Weddell Sea and it is rightfully considered the most transparent in the world. However, there is nothing surprising here either, because in Antarctica there is simply no one to pollute it. The water in the Weddell Sea is so clean that you can see objects located at a depth of up to 79 meters. This is almost equal to the clarity of distilled water. Icebergs can be like an entire city. And that's putting it mildly. Just imagine, the largest iceberg that broke off here, of those that were recorded, of course, was 295 kilometers long and 37 kilometers wide. Once again, 295 kilometers. And sometimes researchers discover strange, very smooth edges that, it seems, could only be formed artificially. But who made them? Let's discuss it in the comments after watching, but for now let's move on to the next point. Your domain name and telephone code. Although Antarctica has no permanent population, the continent has its own .aq domain name and a unique 672 dialing code. Antarctica also has its own, albeit unofficial, currency, the Antarctic dollar. Not the entire territory of Antarctica is covered with ice. For many, Antarctica seems like an endless icy desert, where there is nothing but snow and ice. And for the most part this is, of course, true. But in Antarctica there are also quite vast snowless valleys and even sand dunes. However, do not delude yourself, there is no snow there not because these areas are warmer than others, on the contrary, the conditions there are even harsher. The dry McMurdo Valley experiences strong winds of up to 200 miles per hour. They cause the evaporation of moisture and therefore there is no snow or ice here. Living conditions here are so close to those on Mars that NASA even tested Viking spacecraft in the McMurdo Valley. Well, since we're talking about ice cover, let's ask ourselves, when did Antarctica become covered with ice? The current scientific consensus is that the Antarctic ice sheet formed 30 to 35 million years ago. And since that time, the ice sheet has reached a thickness of several kilometers in places. However, there is one surprising moment in the history of world cartography. Until the 16th century, many cartographers were well aware of the outline of the northern coasts of Europe and modern Siberia, even the numerous islands in the Arctic Ocean, and also had a good knowledge of the full outline of Antarctica. It feels like they even landed there. And from the beginning of the 17th century, everyone forgot about the existence of Antarctica, and all the northern lands became a real blank spot, the territory of terra incognita. And so on until the 19th century. Here, for example, is the map of Piri Reis, which shows a picture before the 16th century with Antarctica without ice, some 500 years ago. Here's how Wikipedia writes about it. Some people believe that the image in the southern part of the map is evidence that ancient cartographers knew about the existence of Antarctica, but most scientists reject the assumption that cartographers of that time could have reliable knowledge about it. But the problem is that the Piri Reis map is not the only evidence in favor of the seditious version of Antarctica blooming 500 years ago. Here is the map of Orontius Phineas from 1531. Antarctica is clearly drawn, in fairly accurate proportions, and even the famous Hyperborea at the North Pole. That is, in the 16th century they still knew well about Hyperborea and Antarctica, not covered with ice. This is the 16th century, approximately the time of Ivan the Terrible. An alternative view is that before the 16th century, the climate on Earth was completely different, much warmer and the North Pole was clearly on the west coast of Greenland. Medieval mariners sailed freely both to the shores of Antarctica and to the North Pole, since there was practically no ice there and it was quite warm. But in the 16th century there was a sharp shift of the poles to the modern position, and the Little Ice Age began. It was then that Antarctica suddenly became covered with ice. This version, oddly enough, is supported by another island covered with a thick layer of ice, Greenland. This is what Adam Olearius, a 17th-century German traveler and geographer, writes in his book. The Journey of the Holstein Embassy to Muscovy and Persia about Greenland back in 1389, Greenland had practically no ice and snow. Icelandic and Norwegian ships sailed freely to it, they freely went ashore and trade. This is confirmed by the Italian philosopher of the late 15th century Giovanni Pontano, who collected numerous information from the sailors of his time about Greenland. He argued that sailing to the flourishing paradise of Greenland was not difficult at all. Numerous bays convenient for navigation, centuries-old routes, huge forests and flowering fields, warmth, complete absence of ice. Modern research confirms that at the beginning of the 15th century, Greenland was thoroughly settled and its territory was full of Vikings who built several large stone cities. For example, in the city of Garda there were up to hundreds of stone houses, there were trading shops, forges, and its own shipyard. Church, it even had its own bishop. The last reliable report about the voyage and return of merchant ships from Greenland came to us from 1410, that is, even in the 15th century, Greenland still lives up to its name, green country, it is all green, developing and thriving. But already in the 16th century, many sailors passing by Greenland began to receive alarming messages that its shores, due to the huge ice, had become so inaccessible that it was not even possible to moor to the shore. In 1586, ships sent by the King of Denmark were unable to approach the Greenland coast because of hundreds of meters of thick ice. It turns out that in just a few decades, Greenland was covered with a thick layer of ice. By the way, the thickness of the Greenland ice sheet is practically not inferior to the Antarctic one and reaches more than 3 kilometers. At the same time, the Greenland ice sheet formed in just 50 years, and the Antarctic ice sheet, according to the official version, in 30 to 35 million years, which raises questions among many researchers. Moreover, there is evidence of a sharp climate change that clearly describes the catastrophic onset of the so-called Little Ice Age at the beginning of the 16th century. Here is one example, MELK Annals of the 15th to 16th centuries, compiled on events in the history of the Frankish state and the Holy Roman Empire, written in a Benedictine monastery in the Austrian city of Melk on the Danube. So, 1502, this year there was a severe flood, which began on the eve of the Ascension of Mary and lasted almost 10 days. Throughout all the cities and castles along the Danube, the water flowed so generously that it became convenient for navigation. The flood completely destroyed houses, and 2 houses in Melk, along with their families, were torn from their places and carried away to the east. It covered meadows and gardens with sand, felled trees, destroyed vineyards, and the stables, along with barns and all kinds of utensils, floated downstream day and night. Eventually, the Danube swept through major cities and villages so furiously that it was barely possible to see a single surviving house. Such terrible floods were observed throughout the period from 1502 to 1508 for all 6 years. Then, in the middle of the summer of 1525, a real ice age sets in Vienna in 1525, in the middle of summer, such a terrible frost suddenly set in that the local residents, who did not have time to hide in their homes, instantly froze on the spot and died throughout the area. Petrified birds fell from the sky like stones. Life in cities and villages stopped for several months. A huge number of people literally died from the cold. For many years, almost all living creatures disappeared in Europe. In the same year, the Danube froze to such an extent that people and horsemen, carts and loaded carts moved freely along it. All the wells and water sources were so frozen that it was impossible to draw water there. In the Polish medieval chronicle there is another message: this year, terrible frosts and snowstorms unexpectedly came in the middle of it. From the terrible cold along the roads, many poor people and merchants died. Even the Roman chronicles for 1525 say the following: this year in the summer a terrible cold suddenly set in Rome. All surrounding lands were quickly covered with snow and ice. Many people and livestock died from the terrible cold. Almost all European medieval chronicles in 1525 mention an unexpected terrible frost, widespread death from the cold, and in subsequent years there was a sharp drop in temperature in many regions of Europe. It was from this year that winter became more severe. Here is a quote from the Notes on Muscovy by Sigismund Herberstein. In 1525 to 1526 there were such severe colds that the earth cracked from the terrible frost. It was such a terrible frost that even water poured into the air or saliva from the mouth froze before it fell to the ground. All the trees died from severe frost. Trees all over Rus turned black the next year. The roads near Moscow were literally littered with frozen bodies of people and animals. Of course, This is just a version, but this version is capturing the minds of more and more people, so we decided to offer it to you for analysis. Now let's continue. Active volcanoes in general, Antarctica is a very calm place in terms of seismic activity. Although, there are also volcanoes here, not only dormant, but also quite active. At least 2 of them have erupted within the last 200 years. And the most famous volcano in Antarctica, which is also the most active, is called Erebus. It is also often called the volcano that guards the path to the South Pole. The largest asteroid crater. This crater is located in the Wilkes Land area and has a crater diameter of about 482 kilometers. Of course, according to scientists, it was formed approximately hundreds of millions of years ago as a result of an asteroid at least 48 kilometers in diameter falling to Earth. The dust raised during the fall and explosion of the asteroid led to centuries-long cooling and, according to one hypothesis, the death of most of the flora and fauna of that era. Well, that's enough for today. Set up notifications so you don't miss new releases. See you later.